thank you very much, Jamie. It's very nice to be here. I'm only going to talk at you for about 30 minutes, or even less if you get bored and start heckling me and tell me to shut up. The title of what I'm going to talk about is "If We're So Equal, Why Are You Listening to Me?" which is a title I've wanted to use for ages and ages, and I haven't felt I've been anywhere where I could actually talk about the issues of people not being that different to each other, and just how equal we are, and in what ways are we different. The reasons for bringing it up here is that outside, on telly, in the radio, in newspapers, there's been one quite interesting repercussion of these tents being here that I've noticed, and people here may have noticed it. It's brought out of the woodwork a lot of people who've wanted to argue that they are special, that they do something that's specially valuable, that they are worth a lot of money, and why don't you appreciate them so much? People who would normally have kept these attitudes a bit quieter and more politely, and were quite happy about how things are and how it's working. And I think it's really useful that that's come out, that there are people saying we are worth our city bonuses, you have to have inequality, there's only one way, it has to be capitalism, that's it. Because before you had these tents here and around the rest of the world, and tents in Sheffield, we have 15 tents in Sheffield, I should add. Before this particular year, a lot of these attitudes were kept very quiet and more in secret in a way. So what I want to try and do is go through what I think the arguments are for inequality, what people put forward, what makes a small group believe that inequality is justified, and how you can begin to help unwind that a bit more. Outside there's the thing about the 99% of the 1%. I'd love to know who first, well, in fact it doesn't really matter, does it, who first fought up the 99 and 1%, but somebody might be able to tell us. As far as I can work out, if you're interested in why a 99-1% division is useful at the moment in Britain, if you look at wealth statistics for Britain, the best off 1%, once you exclude the house you live in and your pension, so the spare wealth people have, the best off 1% have about 53% of spare wealth. The other 99 have 47. So you could justify 99-1 on it actually cuts half the wealth of society off. The question then is that unfair? Is it unfair that just 1% of people have half of all the spare wealth, that they have so much power, and so on? There are several ways in which it's argued that this kind of division is justified. The first way it's argued begins with people's abilities. What you hear people say, IPPR had a nice report that came out a few weeks ago, is they say that our Chief Executive Officer is supremely talented. They are a super able, super intelligent individual. And because of that super talent, that super ableness, they're worth the money they command. And because so much of the rest of humanity, although we care for them a lot, because we're nice and human, but just mentally aren't up to the super fast and super quick thinking of our top people, we just have to pay them a lot. And there are a group of people, there'll probably be people here, hopefully, otherwise it'll get very boring. There are people who really do believe this. I've spent a few years looking into issues like this, which is the reason, you're saying, why on earth are you having to listen to me? It's not because I'm brilliantly clever and I can work these things out. I'm just boring enough to read lots of books about them. Probably not as much as many people, but quite a lot. There are differences between people. There are people born with severe learning difficulties. The number of people born with learning difficulties in the world is going up, as the number of people who are being born into starvation is rising. But most of us, at least in countries with good nutrition, aren't born with those kind of problems. We're born remarkably similar. We're all born with opposable thumbs. Okay, you've all got that same little wiggly thumb. You can move, makes you special compared to other monkeys. Almost all of us are born with binocular vision. It's very useful. You're all born with a brain of a certain size. We're not born into a whole set of slightly different species, which are genetically different from each other, some of which are the great thinkers, some of which should be the toilers of soil and so on. We are born remarkably equal. What does vary though is the extent to which we have different education systems in different countries. There's no country which is utopia, there's no country that's perfect. But there are countries which separate children more than other countries. In those countries which tend to separate children less, Finland's always given as an example, all children tend to do better at school. In those countries which separate children more, one of the classics would be the United States, where they're separated by race as well as money and so on. Children tend to do worse overall. Various maths is the easiest thing to measure because you compare it between countries. And one great problem about education systems that separate is they tend to make people feel stupid at the bottom because you fail lots of them, so you tell them they're stupid. And almost just as bad, they tend to make people at the top feel that they're particularly able because you give them lots of A's. And if you give a child lots of A's, it's very hard for that child not to think that they're very good. Why else would you give them lots of A's if they weren't very good? The majority of A's at A-level in this country go to children from just schools that represent 7% of children, which are the private schools in this country. No fault of the children who go to the private schools in this country that they go there, but they get the majority of the A's. They also have 25% of all our education spending spent on them. And this is an OECD figure. A quarter of this country's secondary education spending goes on just 7% of children. There's only one other country in the OECD that spends more money on a smaller proportion of children, and that country is Chile. So we are a very strange country, and a very unequal country that segregates our children and gives a small number lots and lots of A's. And then separates them further by whether they go to university, what happens to them later. We have an elite who go to a couple of particular universities mainly. Our leader of the opposition and our Prime Minister both did the same course in the same university. It's not a very good way of educating people. But let me zip forward quickly because I've only got about a quarter of an hour left to talk to you before the helicopter comes down too much. One thing people say is that some people are worth lots more money than others. Their pay's worth lots more. What people very rarely do is appreciate how much trouble that creates in general. I'll give you one numerical example that's been occupying me recently. If you look at the total pay bill of this country every year, it's around about 750 billion. That's how much we pay ourselves every year, 750 billion. If you look at the pay bill in 1970, but reduce the inequalities back to where they were in the 1970s, the pay bill's about 550 billion. The 200 billion increase on the pay, this is in real terms, it's slightly complicated, it's not about inflation. The 200 billion increase is almost all amongst the top 1%, sorry, top 10%, and most of that is amongst the top 1%. So the best of people are now paid about 5 or 10 times more than their parents got, rather than 2 to 3 times. Most people, 90%, get 50% more than their parents got. Why does 200 billion matter a year on pay? The reason it matters is that we have 1 million young people unemployed under 25. If you were to employ, I'm going to do the maths for you. This is, I promise you I won't do any more maths, but I like maths. But I think part of the problem of inequality is that people hate maths and they don't get it. And an even worse thing.
If you were to give us, so divide by 50 million, and then it's per head approximately.
Yes, I'll do it this way. Okay? We're going to make it easy, right? Let's say minimum wage is about £7 an hour. Should be, well, it should be about £7 an hour. And you say we're going to work for 50 hours a week. Just to make the maths easy, that's £350 for a week. Then for a year, that's going to be, can anybody help me with the maths? 350 times 50? Go on. How much? 16750. We're doing okay about 16750. Okay, let's do that. About £16,000. Now we've got 1 million young people out of work. So let's multiply about 16,000 by 1 million. What you get is 16 billion. That's the cost of employing all the young people. About 16 billion. We're currently spending every year 200 billion on surplus pay. So you couldn't just employ everybody under 25. You could employ them, and they could employ them again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And the rich could still be the richest. This isn't a revolution. They could still have as much money as their parents, still be better off than everybody else. And what happened in 1970? We didn't have 1 million people unemployed. But people don't link mass unemployment, or the fact we don't have a citizen's wage or other ways of living, with how much money is concentrated amongst the very top in society. And I do worry that it is a hatred of numbers, and then I worry even more that when some people get into numbers, they go, I could explain the numbers, or I could become a stockbroker, and the temptation to become a stockbroker may be a little bit too high for some. Let me zoom on to positive things about this. Inequalities in this country are currently the highest they've been since at least 1918 in terms of income and wealth, and they're even higher in terms of health. So the gaps between people are historically high. Inequalities in almost every other OECD country, apart from Singapore, USA and maybe Portugal, are lower. So it's not hard to say it's possible to be lower. Also, there are many rich people, particularly in mainland Europe, but increasing in Britain, beginning to say, this is becoming acutely embarrassing. I can no longer stand up and say I'm proud to be wealthy. And there is movement from the top to want to change things, as well as from the bottom, and from agitation at the bottom. The bad news is that for the first time I've ever been able to get figures for, I think at least since 1920, you have a situation where incomes at the bottom are now falling in real terms, quite fast. If there isn't a 5% uplift on benefits, that's going to be a dramatic fall. Incomes in the middle are falling slightly. Incomes aren't rising until you get to the top 10%. In the top 10% they're only rising slightly, but the people in the top 10% don't feel okay because the top 1% are rising still quite rapidly. They don't feel okay because the pound's fallen by a quarter, so their skiing holidays cost them more. They think they need a 25% increase in pay to stay where they were before, and also they don't feel happy because the top CEOs have had a 50% pay increase in the last year, but they don't feel happy because everybody's saying that they're scum. So you've got a real problem of sadness all the way up and down this pile, and you've got 200 billion a year that you don't need to be spending on the people at the top, who are only worried about people above them being better off than them. I'm going to end just talking about advantages of equality, because what I think we should be doing is not just saying how terrible the inequality is, but saying how much better things can be when you do become just a little bit more equal, which is what this country has tended to do. It did almost every year between 1929 and 1976, say. The kind of things that happen when you become a little bit more equal is that your children are ever so slightly more likely to go to a school nearer their house, which makes it easier to go to school, which means they're slightly more likely to mix more with other children. Your pay distribution at work becomes a little bit more equal, so that everybody isn't quite so insecure about the people above them getting more, and they're not quite so worried about dropping down and what will happen then. Your benefits are slightly less punitive when you become slightly more equal, so you can actually think about living on benefits if you don't, or if you do live on benefits, you don't have to worry so much about getting into debt forever. If you become more equal, your friends will be more like you. It'll be less socially embarrassing when you work out, or even discuss if you went on holiday or where you went on holiday. Your children can have an honest relationship with you if you're more equal and rich, because they don't have to lie to you, hoping that they'll still inherit your money. They'll be able to stay up where they are. And similarly, your spouse or partner, if money doesn't get in the way, don't have to worry so much. The example I used to give years ago, which I've stopped giving now because it's kind of slightly in bad taste, was based on two of the world's most famous pop artists. One was ABBA, who pay relatively high taxes but choose to carry on living mainly in Sweden because it's nicer. And the other example I used to give was a man who had the Neverland Ranch, who I said have an awful life and it wasn't worth living so unequal in America. But I think Michael Jackson's proved part of the problems about inequality and what happens in the system with so much private healthcare. You've been really patient, and I'm much more looking forward to people arguing and talking about these issues and what can be done than me talking anymore. So I'm going to stop now, but I think I'm going to hand over, unless I'm told otherwise, to the editors at New Internationals magazine,